Welcome to the Compile Swift podcast. I am your host, Peter Whittam. Whether you're new to app development or a seasoned professional, this show covers everything from OSs to tools, news, and techniques, giving you everything you need to stay up to date and make better apps. So let's get on with the show. Alright, this week I am going to be talking about using data in SwiftUI views. This came about because I was recording the next series of videos in my Patreon exclusive content that I have over on patreon.com/PWCOM. And what I needed to do was I wanted to create a data source that could then be used across the application. So that meant using it across multiple views, which meant that I had to dive in looking at the environment object, the observable object, and of course using state in views. So I'm going to talk about that in much more detail after the break.
Time for a break.
Let's talk about Spotify for a second. I've been a long time, many-year user of Spotify Premium, but there's also a free version you can use, so it won't cost you anything. And one of the things that I love about Spotify is I can combine all of my music from the massive library that they have, along with all of the podcasts that I listen to. And you obviously like podcasts because you're listening to this one. So on Spotify, you can follow your favorite podcasts to make sure that you never miss an episode. They're just delivered right to you. And it's also super easy to share with other people. I'm always sharing on Instagram and all the other social networks on my devices, things that I listen to on Spotify. So go ahead and download the Spotify app today and search for the Compile Swift podcast. It's in there along with all the other podcasts you like to listen to, I'm sure. So go ahead and download the Spotify app today.
Break time over.
Okay, so there's a few steps involved, and I'm going to do my best to explain them in this podcast here. It's kind of difficult to talk code, without using visuals, but I'll do my best to explain it, and I'll point you to some resources, and hopefully, too, it won't be too long before I've been able to edit my videos and get that part of the course up. At the moment, it's about an hour long, and I need to edit it down just to, make it into usable chunks. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of rich detail in there. Okay, so what I have is I first of all created a struct for my data model, that describes a note. This was for my code notes rebuild with SwiftUI. So, I have a note, which is a struct. It contains an ID, a date added, date modified, name, language, and content. So that's the model for that. I also have another model that contains the array of those notes, right? That's kind of my main data source that I'm going to use for the application. So nothing special there at first. Basically it's just a class that I've created called notes with a function in there to add a note to the array. Later on, of course, there'll be other features. But the more important part is to make this usable across the application, the SwiftUI application. What I had to do was use the observable object. So you do that by, in this case, saying, class notes of type observable object. Okay. Now inside that observable object, I have a variable for my notes, which is of type array. But what I do to make sure that it can be used by SwiftUI across, multiple views and set it up as an environment object, you have to make it published. So it actually says at published, var notes equals a note of type, an array of type note, and then I have that self-execute, with a closure just to set everything up. Okay, so that's that part. Now, once you've got your data source, whatever it may be, and you've made it an observable object, and you've put some kind of published property in there for it to publish across the application, the next part is you would go into your scene delegate. Now, in the scene delegate, just inside the class, I've got a variable called notes, and so var notes equals notes, right? It's a new instance of the notes class. So that sets up, this data source within the application. Now the important part is, if you think about when you're looking at your code, you have this func scene that SwiftUI sets up for you, and in there it sets the window.root view controller as a UI hosting controller, and then you specify the root view, and if you go in there and look, you're going to see by default it's going to say content view. Well, that's where we need to set up our environment object, and the way we do that is by way of a modifier. So mine actually now says content view dot environment object, And when you put that in, it's going to expect you to specify the object that's going to be that data that becomes the environment object for the application. So all I do there is I pass in the variable that I created within the class called notes. So mine is content view dot environment object, and then notes is the object that I pass in. Now, once you've done all of that, you've now got this environment object set up at the top level content view. And so any views within inside there, which, unless you do something fancy, is going to be all of the views in your application, you can now access it. So what you would do, I'm going to give you an example here. The way I used it, I have this kind of master detail list going on. Okay. So on the master view, which would be a list, think like table view in the old world. So in there, just inside the struct where I create the view, I have to now tell it about this environment object that I want to use in the view. Basically, every view that's going to use an environment object, you've got to set it up and tell it about it, right? Then it becomes, available. Think of it as kind of like an import, but not an import. So just inside my master view, I've got at environment object, and then you just create a variable like you normally would. So I've called my notes. So it's var notes of type notes. Now, because it's got that at environment object at the beginning, that's what makes it stand out from a normal variable, right? If we just put var notes of type notes, then I would just have an instance of my notes class, not what I want here. Okay, so because I've put at environment object, SwiftUI looks at it and goes, okay, I know that you injected this notes environment object up in content view. That must be the one you're talking about. So, okay, I'll go ahead and use that. It's kind of, I guess, like a bit like a singleton, really. So once that's set up there, okay, I then go into my var body sum view. And in my case, I've set up a list. And in that list, I have a for each loop. And it's going to be a little tricky to explain this, but if you've done this before with lists, or you've worked with lists in any way, and you've gone through and done a for each loop in SwiftUI, you'll know that a for each in SwiftUI is not the same as a for each in Swift. So what I've done is I've got a for each notes.notes, because I'm using my notes variable that I created, okay, in the view. And then inside that notes object, you may recall I've got an array. My array is called notes, right? So it's the array within the notes class. And, you have to give a for each loop some kind of ID, some way that SwiftUI can uniquely identify each row in this list, right? Think of it as, an identifier for a table cell, if it was a table, okay? So, I have an ID property in my object within my array, so I just tell it go ahead and use that. So the ID is just set to ID. And then it just says, note in. So note is the object itself, right? So it's one, as it does the loop, the note is one instance, one object, within the array. So, note followed by note and so on until it runs out in the array. So that gives me access to each of the notes in the array. After that, I've got a vertical stack. Now, in my case, I've got a component that I've built in there, but, for the sake of example here, you could just say render the text out to the screen, right? So you may recall back in my model for my note, I said that I have a name property. So I could just say, text note.name, right? And it's going to pull out the name property for each of those notes within the array, and it's just going to render them out. Now, this may be a little confusing at first. Play this back a couple of times and, go look at the Apple documentation. If you just search for environment object, observable object, it's going to come up and explain it. That's all you have to do to make this work. Now, it's very straightforward. It was very confusing at first because, of course, I couldn't help but think of the way we used to do things with Swift. But once you get used to it, you realize that this is a really elegant way of dealing with things. And the sort of added bonus that we get here is because SwiftUI is doing all this complex coding in the background, we only have to do a very little bit of code to set up an object, say this is my environment object, and then in all my views to say, hey, use this environment object, and that's all we have to do. And the beauty of this is because SwiftUI is observing it and watching it and managing it for us, If that data source changes in any way, so let's say I add another note or I remove one or modify one, it's going to invalidate all of the views using that environment object. So SwiftUI is going to say, hey, you know what? I need to re-render these views. So in my case here, if I do something to the data source, I add another note to the array, it's going to re-render my master list for me and automatically update it with the changes that I've made. So we don't have to do any reactive programming or, any fancy manipulation of views or anything like that. Swift is going to take care of it all for us. Sorry, SwiftUI is going to take care of it all for us. So, it's a really nice way once it's set up of just saying, hey, anytime my data changes now, I don't have to worry about updating anything because SwiftUI is going to take care of it for me, and I can get on with making the important features for my application. So it's really elegant once you get used to it. And I'm hoping that, of course, this is going to get a lot better as we get future versions of SwiftUI. So that's basically how I've got mine set up. I'm still working on editing down all the videos explaining and walking through this. And once they're done, I'm going to walk through this step by step all the way, explaining it in a series of videos. And they'll be up on my Patreon for my exclusive Compile Swift subscribers. So, if you go to patreon.com/PWCOM, you'll see those videos will appear there for the Swift subscriber level. If you join that tier, you'll get access to all those videos. I'm still editing. Like I say, I hope to get them up this week. Depends how my workload goes, for the jobby job. So, with all of that said, that's it. We're done. Now, what you want to do is look up the documentation. Like I say, you want to go over to the Apple website, look up the documentation. They give you some examples there that really get you working through it. But I think my videos would be more beneficial to those maybe who are new to SwiftUI, or maybe even, new to iOS development, because I break it down in sort of computer science ways and just explain it. So with that, I'll leave it there. Hopefully this has been useful for you, and I will speak to you next time. Thanks for listening. There is lots more content for you to explore at compileswift.com. While you're there, why not use the contact form to reach out to me with questions or comments? I'd love to hear from you. You can also reach me on Twitter @CompileSwift. Finally, why not hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and maybe throw a review or a star in there while you're at it. It sure would make the day better. Thanks, and may your code compile swiftly.